Welcome back to part three. We are in a four-part series. So, our series is called Vote for Civility. What do you do before, during, and after an election? And that's what we're talking about today. We started this with the idea and the concept, having just written the new C suite book, Civil Leadership in Action. If you haven't gotten it, make sure you get it. This is something that we really wanted to share with people, like what they can actually do when they're in the work environment, how to create more respectful spaces and interactions with people. And so today's conversation and the expert we're talking to today is Dr. Nicole Yeldell Butts. And we're going to be talking about civility and the importance in understanding the power of civility. So I'm glad that you're here, that you've joined us. If you haven't watched the other two, don't worry. We're going to send out some links at the end and you'll get a chance to catch part one and part two. And it's about a 45-minute conversation. If you have questions, please put them in the question part in the webinar, or you can put it in the chat. If you want to raise your hand, you want to ask something, please let us know there as well. But without further ado, I want to introduce you to Dr. Nicole Yeldell Butts. Not only is she a co-collaborator on the Amazon best-selling book, The New C-Suite, that I just mentioned, but she is an incredible, phenomenal woman that you're going to learn about in just a moment. And so I'm going to allow her to do us the honor of sharing with us today what your background is, who you are, and what you do with
Okay, great.
everybody.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So, what I do, I help organizations and individuals become the person or the organization they envision themselves to be. We all have an idea about who we are or who we want to be or how we want the world to see us and receive us. I help organizations and people create that and actually become who it is they envision themselves to be. And I do that through transformational coaching. I do that through culture strategy, so working with organizations on developing an intentional organizational culture and helping the executives create that culture. Because one of the things we'll talk about today is the significant impact leaders, executive leaders in particular, have on their organizational culture and where civility comes into play there. So I help organizations intentionally create, design, and cultivate that culture that they want to have. So
Now,
that's the work I do.
I talked about the book that you were a huge part in, and you had a chapter of this. So we're doing a little book plug right now, real
Yeah.
quick. And tell the folks who haven't had a chance maybe to get a copy of the book
Mhm.
what your chapter was about and how it kind of related to civility.
Great question. So my chapter was actually on inclusive leadership. And I spent about 20-25 years working in people and culture within organizations. So again, helping organizations create culture and helping organizations determine how best to utilize people and create the culture that's going to really create high performing teams and help that organization again be who they want to be, achieve what they want to achieve in the world. So my role was people and culture for 25 years. And part of that included DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. How do you create not just diverse organizations, but inclusive cultures within organizations? And so my chapter was on inclusive leadership because one of the things that I found is that, sometimes organizations try and do too much, and because they're trying to do too much, they don't really get what they're trying to get done achieved. And so my chapter really focused on one idea around how do you create inclusive cultures. And that idea was how do you encourage, embrace, and invite ideas and value ideas from throughout your organization, from diverse perspectives in your organization. And part of that is about how do you create civility? How do you create an environment where people are not quiet? They're not shy. They're not afraid of sharing ideas or challenging status quo. How do you create an environment where they are willing to share those diverse ideas, those diverse perspectives, and challenge an organization to think differently? And we can do that if we do that in a civil way.
Well, in speaking to organizational culture, which you just described, knowing that that was the work that you spent 25 years doing, plus that was your chapter, what have you found is what does the role civility play in executive leadership? So when you're an executive leader, how does that carry over into organizational culture and morale, right? We're thinking of elections, which is less than a month away.
Yeah.
And so what is the role? What role does civility in executive leadership play in organizational culture and morale?
Yeah. So one of the things that executives aren't always fully aware of is the impact that they have on organizational culture. They are the architects really of organizational culture. They sometimes come in thinking, well, this is the culture that already exists. I can't really do anything about it, right? It's the one that's here and I just need to learn how to work within it. But they really have the ability to design and create a culture that they either want to have or they don't want to have, right? So here's what I mean when I say that. When you just kind of haphazardly allow organizational culture to take hold, then you wind up getting whatever you get. When you intentionally decide what you want it to be and you take the steps to create that, to foster that, to cultivate that, then that's the role of organizational leaders. That's the role of executives. Because the way in which they interact and behave, the things that they value, the things that they reward, the things that they put their attention on is what the organization recognizes. And so if your executive leaders believe in civility, if they encourage civility, if they model civility, then you can create a civil organizational culture. Morale and retention, I'll talk about those two kind of together. One of the values of civility is that it has the potential to create what's called psychological safety within an organization. So, psychological safety is that space where people feel as though they can bring their full authentic self to work. They can have different ideas and different opinions. They can share those ideas and those opinions without fear of retribution, without fear of dismissal, without fear of ridicule. And those ideas won't only be received, but they will be valued. Doesn't always mean that they're going to be enacted, but at least I know that when I share them, they are heard, they're received. The fact that I shared them is valuable, and that creates a sense of psychological safety. And within that psychological safety, organizations can then be much more collaborative. The people within those organizations can feel more welcomed. They can feel a greater sense of belonging, a greater sense of value, and that supports their sense of morale within the organization, which also supports retention within the organization.
Now we
The,
know that there are poor leaders out there. Like we have
oh, yeah.
leaders that run companies that are mediocre, that are unethical. We see it because we watch the news and
Yeah.
we see it all the time. So we know that there's a possibility if I'm one of those kinds of leaders and I'm shaping my culture,
Mhm.
that the culture that I'm shaping may not be a great one.
Right.
And so when we see this kind of loss of civility that may be happening in organizations,
Yeah.
and the rise of incivility, who does that affect and what happens to not only an organization but the community in which the organization works, the customers in which the organization serves?
Yeah, it's interesting because incivility often goes even beyond the direct organization or company, right? So when you have an uncivil organization, when you have leaders that are acting in an uncivil way, and therefore people within the organization begin to act towards one another in an uncivil way, a couple things happen. One, the likelihood that you're going to have some lawsuits and some civil issues is high. When I say
That
civil
part.
issues, meaning civil lawsuits, right? Because there's likely bullying, there's likely harassment, there's likely discrimination. So there are other things that go along with that incivility, right? And so when you're going to have teams that are not productive, collaborative, innovative teams, uncivil behavior, incivil behavior is it's going to prevent any sense of collaboration, any sense of creativity or innovation. So you're going to lose that competitive edge of collaboration and innovation and creativity. You're not going to have highly functioning, highly productive teams because they don't engage with one another in such a way that allows them to be that. Again, you may have some lawsuits. Oftentimes, that behavior becomes public knowledge. And we've actually seen this on the news before, where we find out about organizational leaders and their really unethical behavior, because civil leadership really is about ethical leadership, right? And so we find out about their uncivil leadership. We find out about the kind of experiences employees are having within the workforce. That then makes your customers question, is this an organization I want to give my business to? Is this an organization I want to partner with? So when you're looking for other companies to partner with, to do business with, they look at who you are as an organization. And so if they have determined that that's not the kind of organization they want to be associated with, they won't. So you're going to see a decline in morale. You're going to see a decline in retention. You're going to see a decline in productivity and collaboration and innovation. You may have a decline in partnerships and customer base as well. You also asked about society. You know, one of the things that's interesting right now is that our business leaders are playing a much larger role in society, sometimes in a good way, sometimes in a bad way. But people look at organizational leaders as societal leaders. They don't just look at them as leaders of their company, they look at them as societal leaders. So when you are acting in an uncivil way, and you are now taking that out into the broader society, we create this domino effect of incivil behavior. And I think we're seeing that right now in our society, this domino effect of uncivil or incivil behavior.
There's a couple of people that come to mind when I think of these leaders, and you're exactly right. And I don't think I've ever thought of it that way, that people that own certain companies, they're leaders of their own companies, but they have such a greater influence in society as a whole.
Yes.
And they shape the way that certain things are run, even the way the country is run. I think it's probably not a far stretch if we go back and we know, like, because it's campaign season, well, it was campaign season, people are running for office and what have you,
Right.
that they get these huge donors, and usually the donors of these CEOs of large companies. It's like, okay, well, you are owner of a large company, but yet you have a stake in this particular political, this person, right? And that person who you have stake in, you're helping to shape
Yes.
the outcome potentially of that individual.
Yeah.
And so that can be dangerous, in a sense that when you're allowing someone to have such influence, that it affects things even just outside of their sphere, but really globally. So I think it's important. Let's define uncivil behavior. I think just so we can give context to, because when
Yeah.
I talked with Dr. Natalie in the first one, we were talking about different behaviors of what to do when we're in these respectful places. And I think it just helps the audience to understand, when you say uncivil behavior, give some examples maybe from your personal experience, what you've seen,
Yeah.
what you've seen on the news. What does that look like? What does that sound like? And for all of us.
So before I do that, can I talk about what civility looks like?
Yes.
Because I think that's equally as important, if not more so, right? So one thing about civility that's really important for us to understand is that it requires us to practice mindful communication, right? So we need to be very intentional and mindful about the way in which we are engaging with people. Civil discourse allows us to focus on constructive dialogue. How do we have even in the face of adversity, even in the face of differences, different ideas, different cultures, different values, how do we engage in conversation in such a way that I'm there to understand one another, the other person, and I'm there to engage in constructive dialogue and constructive problem solving. And it's about the issue, it's not about the person. Because as soon as we make it about the person, we've lost our civility. Because now it's become personal. Now we start questioning one another's humanity. So civility is about mindful communication that focuses on constructive dialogue, and it really focuses on a sense of shared humanity, right? So that's what our civility is, right? Incivility is the opposite of that. Incivility is when we are there to win a race or win an argument. So civility is about collaboration. Incivility is about competition. I want to win, whatever that win may be. My values are more important than your values. My life experience is more important than your life experience. I'm going to win this. Incivility can sound like dismissiveness. It can sound a lot like sarcasm, right? And so I see that a lot in business where leaders just they think they're being humorous, so they're displaying some sarcasm, but that shuts people down. So it's dismissiveness, it's sarcasm, it's personal. So it moves from the issue to the person, what it is they're doing or what it is they said, as opposed to what the issue that we're trying to focus on. It can look like bullying, it can feel like bullying. You know that you're engaged in something that's incivil if you start to feel as though you're not safe. You want to back out or you don't want to engage. That's
Mhm.
what happens when we experience incivility. It makes us not want to engage. It makes us feel unsafe, makes us feel challenged, and not challenged in a good way, like, let me think about that. No, but like, I want to defend myself kind of a challenge. So that's the difference between civility and incivility. I
Why
mean,
do there's the two other authors that I know have written books. This topic of civility has come up probably more this year than I've seen in years past. But it could be that
there's a
thing,
reason for that.
well, it could be that thing, like when you get a new car and then as soon as you see all that car on the streets and you never saw that car before you got the new car, but now that you got the new car, you see it everywhere.
Right.
Now that there's this book that we've collaborated on civility, I feel like I'm seeing it everywhere. But there are two gentlemen that are good friends of mine who both have written books on civility. One called Civil Unity, and the other one was about civility in the workplace,
Yeah.
and then we have the new C-suite. Why do you think there's such a rise and increase with this topic, this subject matter, even beyond the election? I think it's important to talk about the election. Let's talk
Yeah.
about why this is coming up now this year. And then after the election, why do we need to continue to focus on this as a subject matter and weaving that into our organizations?
So I think the reason we're hearing so much more about civility, I think there's a small part that's like that new car and you see it everywhere, but I think a bigger part is that we really are having the conversation. And the reason we're having the conversation is because we've had a breakdown in civility within our societal discourse. And so when you have a breakdown of civility, you have an escalation of polarization. And people feel that. It creates a sense of unease and a sense of anxiety. So we are as a nation, and I'm going to argue even possibly globally, we are experiencing a breakdown in civility, which has risen our polarization. And so that's why this conversation is happening because people are beginning to understand that, I used to be able to disagree in an agreeable way, right? I used to be able to share what I was thinking or share my opinions and not feel as though my humanity was being challenged. We're at a point in our society where people are feeling as though their humanity is really being challenged. And that is because of that breakdown in civility. So we have to go through a process of rebuilding that civility. But we first have to recognize that that's what's happening, right? We're not crazy. We're not making it up. And I shouldn't have said it that way, but we're not making it up. This is happening. And so we have to go through a process of rebuilding our skill in civility. Because remember, one of the things I mentioned is it does require mindfulness. We need to be intentional about the way in which we are engaging and the words that we're using. We need to be intentional about how we back out of conversations when we find that it's not actually a civil conversation. So we have to rebuild this skill of civility as not just a nation, but I think as a global entity.
And I'll point out because you did mention something, how to back out or de-escalate situation. And I know both in part one and part two, and we'll share that with our audience. The the expert panelists in those sessions talked about steps to kind of how to appropriately back out of a conversation,
Yeah.
how to de-escalate if you don't feel like you want to engage in that kind of conversation is important. But I like that you said, we used to be able to disagree in an agreeable way. It was, you have your opinion, I have my opinion. Okay, yeah, we might have differences, and that's
Sure.
okay. You go about your merry way. And what I have seen myself as well is there, like you said, this polarization is that now if we disagree, it's I don't like you. And not only do I not like you, I'm gonna unfriend you. And
Right.
not only am I gonna unfriend you, I'm gonna go on a social media rant and I'm gonna talk about people, or I'm gonna dial in on my beliefs
Yes.
and I'm gonna make it this big thing. And oh, by the way, hey, if we work together, I don't want you work on my team. I don't want you on this project. And so now we've taken these other kinds of dangerous steps
Yeah.
where it's affecting my livelihood. It might be affecting my paycheck because
Absolutely.
of this disagreement. And if you're in a position of authority, like a leader,
Hmm.
and you're of a company that's shaping your culture, that can be even more dangerous. When have you seen a situation where people, like, you worked at organizations and I know you worked a lot with DEI, have you seen situations where they've been able to turn it around, where they've been able to find common ground through a difference? So initially, hey, we don't agree, or you have your viewpoint, you're this, I'm that. um but hey, this is how we can find common ground and move forward. Have
Yeah.
you been able to see where those bridges have been made, even though we have differences?
Yeah. We always have differences, and the differences aren't the problem, right? The problem is the way in which we engage in that conversation. In fact, differences can bring us closer together when we effectively work through them, right? They're opportunities for growth and stronger relationships. So your question is, have I seen where we've been able to do this? Yes, I've seen it in a variety of situations where we have been able to kind of bridge that gap. One of the things that helps bridge that gap in organizations is to focus on the shared vision, which is why executives are so important for setting what is that vision. Who are we as an organization? That is always our North Star. So when we focus on the vision, the way in which we achieve the vision, we have differences about how we can go about doing that. But as long as we have that shared vision, that's our North Star, that's our guiding light. So how do we go about achieving that? One of the things that I have done that's been really helpful in some organizations where they were struggling with this was to actually have people who are on different sides of a strategy to meet, to hear one another's sides, but you can't respond to what that other person is saying. Because we know one of the things that happens is we hear things and we get triggered, right? Or we hear things and we want to have a rebuttal. Yeah, but okay, but what if we do? There's always a rebuttal, and we're often very busy thinking about our rebuttal and not really listening to what the other side is saying. So we've had this conversation before. This is common knowledge, right? One of the things that can be helpful is to put people in a room together, ask them to share what their thoughts are, what their ideas are. The other side is just listening, maybe writing down. And then when that's finished, they say, here's what I heard you say, right? So strategy you may even use in personal relationships, right? Here's what I heard you say. That's the end of that. And then we do it again where the other side says, okay, so here's what I'm thinking about. You just listen, and here's what I heard you say. What I then do is have them leave and go back and contemplate, think about what that other side said. Write it down, reflect on it. Where can you find some common ground? That's what they're saying. Where do you think there might be some common ground? So when we come back together again, the conversation is, here's again what I heard you say. Here's where I think there may be common ground. And so we're starting from a place of intentionally looking for common ground. We're not starting from a place of competition. We're not starting from a place of who's going to win this. We're starting from a place of collaboration. I want to collaborate with you on this, because we're ultimately trying to reach that North Star together. So that's a strategy that I have found to be particularly helpful. You know, one of the things I've been thinking about the last several years is, I don't know, Tiana, when you were in school, if they still had debate teams.
Yes,
Um,
my son is actually on a debate team now. He has
they
debate
don't.
at
A
school.
lot of schools don't have debate teams, but here's the value of debate teams. The way they set up debate teams is they give you a topic. Not be a topic that you find yourself on the pro side of. You are you are to then do the research and argue for, in favor of a side that you may not normally be in favor of. The value in that is that it teaches us to look for, I'm going to say high points, to look for where are the important issues in this. I still may not come out as a pro on it, meaning pro versus con, but what I've been able to do is look at an issue from the side of trying to understand it. And when you take that out of conversations, when you take that out of business, when you take that out of organizations, the need to try and understand something, then that's when we get to, well, it's just going to be me against you, and we're just going to be doing this, right? So those debate teams, I think, created a lot of value for folks.
Communication is at the center of everything that I've hearing in this series as we've been talking about this communication, how we engage people in dialogue and meaningful conversations in a way, in your words, that is mindful, that is respectful, and that is not divisive.
Mhm.
And that communication and the effectiveness or ineffectiveness is it essentially drives a lot of what we're talking about. I do believe a driver in all of this too is where we come to the table with our own beliefs,
Mhm.
our own values,
Yeah.
and knowing that then shapes how we communicate because we think it and then we say it. And I know that there are people that
And we don't often pause in between the two.
that is true.
Mm.
And there are people that will resist the idea of why do I have to tailor what I'm going to say? Why do I have to practice
Yeah.
mindful communication? I'm 60 something years old or I've been around the block and that always really bothers me that people that take a stance of I'm just this way. This is who I am. You have to adapt to me. And there are leaders that take that stance. And people then become resistant to this mindful communication and this kind of approach. And so, how would you um, work with someone, a leader perhaps, who is resistant in practicing this and embracing it in their organization, saying, hey, we're going to do this exercise. We're just going to listen, or we're just going to ask questions, or we're going to take a different kind of view, or whatever. How do you work with someone who is just flat out resistant?
It's a great question. One of the really important aspects of civility is emotional intelligence, right? You have to have some self awareness, you have to have some self regulation, and particularly as an executive leader, understanding the impact you have on other people, right? As an executive leader, your impact on the people within that organization is much stronger than mine might be, right? Because I might be able to get away with saying something flip or sarcastic. When an executive leader says something flip or sarcastic, that comes across very differently. So, part of emotional intelligence is understanding the impact you actually have on other people. So, when you talk about leaders in the sense of resistance, helping them develop a greater sense of self-awareness and and control impact on other people is part of that process, right? Because they need to understand that no, just because you are the leader, if you want an environment, and this is a really important question for leaders to reflect on, if you want an environment where people are truly collaborative and innovative, what is that going to require of you? If you want to stay exactly where you are and make the assumption that, well, I'm the leader, so I get to say what happens, then you're probably doing just fine. There's probably nothing you need to do because you've already created a culture where people are not going to be collaborative, they're not going to be innovative. So you have to ask yourself, what is the culture that I want to create? And then how do I go about doing that? And what right now might I be doing that's getting in the way of that? And it might be my personal resistance, right? So, but a lot of, I shouldn't say a lot, there are some leaders who are perfectly okay with the idea that I'm the leader, I'm 60 years old, I want to say, you're going to have a toxic work environment.
Well, and on top of that, leaders are, and this is people just in general, we are not as self-aware as we think we are. There was a study, I taught a class on self-awareness, and I think the study was like 87% of people believe that they're self-aware when in fact it's like 13%.
Yeah,
So you have to have people again in your sphere, in your circle, that are okay with telling you what you need to hear and not what you want to hear. And honestly, great leaders are going to ask for that feedback. They're going to seek it and pursue it with
absolutely.
everything that they have. And if you're not that kind of person, or you don't work for someone who is actively pursuing that kind of feedback and wanting to improve in their own way, and actually
Yes,
you seeing the improvements along the way, then that would raise a little bit of an eyebrow for me.
as well
I
as
have a
should.
question, and
Yeah.
this is coming through the chat.
Okay.
This is one of our attendees who's asked a question, and he says, given the next 2 weeks and the current climate, perhaps you can share 3 pieces of advice that you would give leaders as their climates will be impacted regardless of the results. Fantastic question.
Great question. So the first thing I'm going to say is don't ignore the fact that people are engaged in this. Don't ignore the fact that some people are suffering, that people are preoccupied, that they're distracted, that regardless of the outcome of the election, they're going to be upset people. So the first thing is don't ignore the fact that it's happening. Work with your communications team. Hopefully you have a strategic communications team that can help you craft some kind of a communication that acknowledges the way that people are feeling while also encouraging ongoing civility in the workplace, maybe asking people to focus on what are the things they're working on together, but acknowledge that this is a difficult and challenging time. Um, and maybe even show a little bit of vulnerability that you too are struggling with the atmosphere, not necessarily the candidates, but the atmosphere, right? So one of the things that is interesting when it comes to executive leaders is people feel a deeper sense of connection and trust with their executive leaders when those executive leaders show some level of vulnerability, right? So be vulnerable and work with a strategic communication team to come up with some kind of a message that acknowledges where we are at this point in time, right? That's the first thing. Second thing, as a leader, be sure you yourself are displaying and practicing civility. Make sure that you are engaging with people in such a way where you're not challenging their values, their beliefs, their cultures, right? So your sense of civility has to be on high display over the next couple of weeks. So that's the second piece. The third piece is, and this is for everyone, executives and non-executives alike, honor your own sense of peace. You know, one of the things that happens when we are in uncivil environments is that it is a significant emotional drain on us. And so we need to recognize that this does have a weight, that this does have an emotional weight on us. And so we need to honor our own well being and our own self care. So if you find yourself in conversations that you don't think are the other person's able to be civil or you're not able to be civil, um, remove yourself from that. Don't engage. Not everyone is going to be able to be civil right now. Some people may not even realize they're not being civil. When you find yourself in those environments, you need to figure out how to de-escalate and how to remove yourself from those. If for no other reason than to preserve your own sense of self and your own well-being. We don't have to fight and argue everything, right? So particularly as an executive leader, what is it that you're willing to engage in and what do you need to step away from? So those are the three things I'm going to say to you over the next couple of weeks.
So we have another question, and it is, Um, Please share a realistic time frame for a medium to large organization to genuinely change their culture for the better. When the C suite is engaged and on board with the need for a cultural change. So, what's the time frame? So, like, what kind of time frame are we looking at realistically for a small, medium to large organization? They want to change. C suite's on board. What does that time frame look like?
They're not going to like the answer to this. Real culture change takes a couple years.
Mm,
It really does. You can begin to see some changes much more quickly, but when you talk about real culture change, it's going to take you a couple years to achieve that because, and one, leadership really does need to be on board. Now, let me say this about leadership being on board. Oftentimes, leaders think they're on board and they intend to be on board, they mean to be on board. But it's not until we start asking the questions like, one, how did we get here in the first place, right? What has been keeping us here? Because wherever we are, we're there for a reason. One, what got us there, but also what are the things that are keeping us here? That's status quo stuff. That's the kind of stuff that's just baked into the organization and is somehow being reinforced and rewarded. So when we start asking questions about what keeps us here, what's going to get in the way of us becoming that culture that we want to create, that's when it starts to get hard. And that's when leaders start to go, ooh, wait a minute, but that goes against this, right? So there's a lot of work that leaders actually need to be able to do in understanding how they got there, why they are still there, and the things that are going to get in the way of where they're trying to go. But ultimately, when you talk about culture change, it really does take a couple years.
Well, and you have people that may not be on board with the change outside of being an executive team as
Yeah.
well. And so you having to navigate those differences that can be hurdles that you have to overcome in the midst
Mhm.
of trying to do the thing that you're trying to change. I worked with a company, a local government agency a few years back, won an RFP for an initiative that they were doing, and it was like a 24-month uh, initiative. And I had a team. It was like a 5, 6 person team, 2-year contract, and we had a plan. I mean, we had it laid out. We had a time frame. We had all of these wonderful
It's always
things.
a plan. Yeah.
Oh, always a plan. Always a
Mhm.
plan. And they had written it really, and we were like just kind of meeting the milestones. And then I would say maybe 4 months, 5 months into the plan, the biggest hurdle that we had to overcome was the individuals that were tasked. It was about maybe 15 to 18 individuals that were, like, let's say they were on this project team.
Mhm.
It was all of their differences, their ideas, their what they thought should be done as opposed to, the team that was hired to do certain things. Um, and that was the biggest hurdle we had to
Yeah.
overcome was this resistance from individuals wanting to go down a different direction. The path was already laid. It
Right.
was like, we just want, here's your role in this. They wanted to redefine their role basically. And role clarity is another thing. This is not about role clarity, but it was worth bringing up. So you have a plan,
Yeah.
and I thought it was a realistic plan, but there were some hurdles that you had to overcome. So all that being,
Absolutely.
so let me ask you this question because I asked it to Dr. Natalie Parks. I
Before you
asked
ask me
it to,
that, can I just go back to the last
yeah,
question real quick? Because
absolutely.
I
And then
do
I'm
want
gonna
to say
ask you
this.
this
You
question that
know,
I asked.
there may be people on the call who have a smaller sphere of influence, right? So maybe
Mm-hmm.
they're divisional directors or divisional leaders or department leaders. Maybe they just have a team of people. When you think about changing the culture within your sphere of influence, it doesn't have to take quite as long. So if you have a team of people that you're working with, you all can set that shared vision for your team and define what does it look like? What does it look like? What does it sound like? What are our expectations of one another? And how do we hold ourselves accountable to those expectations? You can do that within your sphere of influence, and it won't take a couple years to see that change.
Okay, good point. Good point. So I asked this question to the first two expert panelists that we had, and I want you to imagine election is 2 weeks away,
Yeah.
roughly, right? So it's the day after the election, and employees, people that are listening, they got to go to work, right?
They
They
gotta go
show
to
up to
work.
work, and there's people celebrating. They're excited because their candidate won, but my candidate did not win. Okay, so I want you to help the person and help both of the people really.
Really, both.
Because should we be celebrating? That's another question. But help me. I'm feeling some kind of way now that this person is celebrating, because before this, I didn't really know where they stood, because, politics, we kind of leave it
Yeah.
out. Historically, we've left it out, like religion.
Hmm.
We've left out personal status and things like that, marital status, all of that. So now I know
Right.
what position you are, where you stand, and I'm feeling some kind of way about it. Help me. How do I remain civil? How do I communicate? Do I not say anything? What should I do?
Well, do I communicate is the first part of the question. And one of the things you need to ask yourself in that question is, what's my relationship? What's my existing professional work relationship with this person? And I'm going to distinguish that, because your relationship with your cousin or your mom is different. This is a work relationship at the end of the day. And you guys may have become friendly. You may have gone out for lunch, but that doesn't mean that that relationship in and of itself is a personal relationship. It is still a work relationship. So understand what your relationship is with this person, the way in which you have to work with or engage with this person. So do you work on projects together on a regular basis? Do you have deliverables that you work on together? Or is this person just someone who happens to be down the hallway from you, right? And you just see them when you walk in. So ask yourself, what is the relationship and what is the need for our ongoing relationship? Again, if we have project deliverables together, I need to have a good working relationship with you. I don't need to be your best friend, but I need to at least have a good working relationship with you. If it's just the person I walk by in the hallway on my way to my office and we say good morning every morning, that's different. So, one, define what that relationship is, because if it's just the person who you walk past in the morning, you probably don't need to have a conversation about this. You can probably, good morning. You can keep saying good morning. That's the end of that, right? You don't need to go any deeper. If it's someone who you have deliverables with, and it's important for you that the two of you are able to engage in a productive, professional way, and their behavior is contradictory to that, then you can have a conversation about that. Now, keep in mind, if they're just celebrating, but it isn't impacting the work, maybe it's a simple matter of, okay, congratulations, right? Election's done, it's over. Let's refocus our energies, right? I appreciate that you're excited. Let's refocus our energies. But if it's actually getting in the way of the work, then you need to be able to have a conversation with the person. And again, focus it on the issue at hand, which is the work, not their candidate, not the views of their candidate, not what you think is going to happen to the country now that their candidate has won the election. That's not for you. This is a work relationship. So focus it on the issue at hand. How do we continue to meet these goals together, to deliver these deliverables together? But first, decide the relationship, if it's worth the conversation, and then if it is worth the conversation, go ahead and have it, but focus it on the issue. Don't make it personal. And that's the part of civility, right? The civility is about making it about collaboration and constructive dialogue, not about competition and not about the person or the individual. Does
And
that
if I'm the
address
other
that?
person that is celebrating, because you talked earlier about mindful communication, we don't only communicate with our words, we communicate
Absolutely.
with our body language and our expressions and things like that. And so, me, doing one of these, high fiving the guy in the other cubicle, I might not have even opened my mouth, but
Right.
I got
Right.
some pictures up in my little station,
Oh gosh, the
whatever. I
pictures.
got I
Yeah.
got a little hat, I got some colors, I got a little
Memorabilia. Right. Right.
I'm walking in, I haven't said a word, but
Right.
all of these things, I'm communicating a whole lot. So help me if I'm that person. I need to have mindful communication and say to myself,
Absolutely.
I'm happy. I'm glad. There may be others that are not. Again, what should and should I not do? What's appropriate? What might be inappropriate? What's civil? What might be uncivil?
Yeah. So I think if you are the winner, your candidate has won the election. One, you've already won. Okay. So you don't need to gloat. You don't need to come into the office making clear everybody knows that your team won last night's game. You don't need to do that, right? So everyone is already aware of who won the election. So recognize again that you are in a workplace, you are there to get work done that's unrelated to the outcome of this election. So I'm going to say be a gracious winner, and a gracious winner isn't necessarily a boastful winner. So keep that for the folks that you know outside of work who are in alignment with your election or your vote. Be a gracious winner and keep it to yourself. Now, I will say, I shouldn't say keep it to yourself. Be a gracious winner and do not come in with the intention of gloating and making sure everyone understands just how thrilled and excited you are. Now, let me say this though. There are going to be people who are going to be extremely relieved at whatever the outcome is, and there are going to be another group of people who are going to be distressed. We have become so polarized that this is not an election where people are going to feel there's no neutrality in this election. People aren't going to feel a sense of, oh, okay, well, that's over with. What they're really going to feel is, oh my God, what's coming next, regardless of who wins, because we have become so polarized. So for those people whose candidate wins, there's going to be a sense of relief and a sense of deep joy. For the people whose candidate did not win, there's probably going to be a deep sense of distress. So to your point about our words aren't the only way in which we communicate, you may actually see somebody's entire body language change. They may wear the exact same thing they wore the day before, but their body language has completely changed. Their facial expression has changed, either because they are relieved and joyful or because they are utterly distressed. So recognize that that's going to happen too and be prepared for that, right? So if you're relieved, great. Be relieved. Don't necessarily take your glee into the workplace. And if you're distressed, again, you don't need to come in foul attitude, throwing stuff and fussing at people. So we have to be mindful about the way in which we are appearing and how we move forward after this election.
I remember when not I remember early in 2020 when a lot of people were talking about the civil unrest. And it was where we saw a lot of the forums and the town halls come to play, where organizations hadn't really done that. They hadn't created a
Yeah.
space where people could talk openly and vulnerably about how they were feeling about what was going on in the country.
Hmm.
When companies did that, and those that did it well, they learned things about their employees that they hadn't learned, but they were able to, I think, step into someone's shoes and really see a different perspective. And for those companies that did it and did it well for the right intentions and actually have continued to stay the course, I think it's worked well for them in the long run about how
Great.
they, shaped not only their culture, but just again, the humanity.
Yeah.
If we were to take that kind of same posture, again, being more proactive this time, though, because that was a reaction to something grave that happened in 2020. They reacted, we kind of everybody jumped in, started doing a lot of various things. This election could potentially create, to your point, the same. You're going to have people that are glad, you're going to have people that are grieving
Yes,
and
absolutely.
grieving the loss of what they think has happened or is happening.
Hmm.
And that level of grief creates anxiety, creates stress, as you said. Maybe there's a mental health was very big. It still is very big,
Hmm.
but early in 2020. So with this is kind of my last question, and then I'll open it up to if there's anyone else who has any other questions. Um, is there something proactive that our leaders can begin doing in preparation of this for the fallout, for the aftermath of this election and what it will bring?
Yeah, so I said earlier, I forget the question, but one of the things I suggested is that leaders consider working with their strategic communication team to develop some kind of a communication, right? That says, I understand that we're in a tense spot, that people are feeling anxiety and all these things. So you can work with your strategic communication team to prepare something, to start saying something now, but also prepare something to come out after the election, right? And you need to make sure that whatever your message is, it is aligned again with your shared vision, your North Stars and organization, your values, and what is it that you want to remind people about how they engage in the workplace, right? So, what are the values that we have? How do we expect those values to show up the day after the organization? Lots of companies have a value of respect, but it's a word and they haven't said what that means, what that looks like, what that sounds like. Now is the time to say, here's what that looks like. Here's what that sounds like. Here's what we are expecting from you to demonstrate respect for your coworkers, right? So absolutely they can do something proactive in that regard. And that's what I would suggest they do, is create some kind of a communication. Should they have a town hall? If they have the skill to have a town hall, right? Town halls can go very, very wrong if they're not done properly, they're not done effectively, or if they're a one-off. So if you're going to have a town hall of some kind, I would really encourage organizations to consider one, a facilitated town hall. I don't know that your leaders need to be the ones doing it or moderating or facilitating that, but you need to have a skilled moderator, facilitator conducting that town hall, and there needs to be a purpose. If it's just so that people can vent, that's not going to fare well, because what happens after they vent, right? So if you're going to do something like that, you need to have a very clear intention as to why you're doing it, what you want to get out of it. Is this something that's going to be continued and ongoing? And if so, in what way? And how is that going to be facilitated? Because what happens sometimes is organizations open up this can of worms and they don't know what to do with it once the can is open, right? And then it actually makes things worse. So it can be effective if you do it effectively. So those are the two things I would say. The third thing I would say,
The facilitator is a good idea too, because the facilitator is something that was brought up, I think, in our second session
mhm,
about having someone skilled. So
yeah, skill
definitely
matters.
in
Yeah.
line with that.
But the third thing is, you know, this is probably going to be a tiny bit controversial and not necessarily feasible for everyone. You know, there may be some value for some organizations to say, hey, look, election is on Tuesday. We're taking Wednesday, we're closed. For just because this has been high anxiety for a lot of people, and we just want to give people a moment to decompress. We're going to give you that day just to take a moment to decompress. Get yourself together. And the truth is, we're probably not going to know the outcome of the election by
I
Wednesday
like that
anyway.
idea.
But there is some value, or if you don't want to close and give the day off, you can say to divisional leaders, department leaders, hey, let people honor their personal time. If they want to take a personal day, we're going to let people know in advance. We encourage you to take a personal day. We encourage you, to take that time so that you can take care of yourself. So even if they don't close, they can encourage people to take a day to take care of themselves.
I really like that idea. I think that honors the space for everybody, because you don't know where people are going to land.
Right.
And so as opposed to saying, hey, we're just going to give it off because we don't know, people didn't, their candidate didn't win. We want to make sure. It's like you're not doing it for that reason. It's like we just want to, there's already a lot of, like you said, polarization, divisiveness, a
And
lot
we
of
know
different
that.
people. This just kind of honors that. So I love that.
Yeah.
So we have one of our last questions, and it speaks to what you were just talking about with the question of being proactive. Should we have town halls? How do we set in these things in place, and them being part of company values? And so this question says, what are your thoughts on incorporating? I think you partially answered this already, on incorporating civility as an expectation in the workplace, either through formal policies, standards, or behavior or values. So I think you partially answered that, but what are your thoughts on making it, like, again, it's part of our policy, it's part of our code of conduct, if you
Yeah.
will, here in the workplace.
Yeah. I'm a huge proponent. I do think there's great value in
And real quick, this is going to
organizations.
be rapid fire because we only got like 5 minutes. So
I think it is a great thing for organizations to do, to put together a statement of civility. What does that mean? But when you do it, it has to be more than words. You need to be able to speak to what does it look like, what does it sound like, what does it feel like. You need to be able to model it. You need to be able to say when it's not happening and the way in which it's not happening. So just to put together a statement is one thing. How do you make that statement come to life?
and it could it be something that's measured?
It absolutely can be something that is measured.
Yeah, I've worked with HR folks for a long time and I had an opportunity to see, like we have performance evaluations or scorecards. Sometimes people will put their workplace behavior or work ethics a part of values or, maybe as part of a performance evaluation. Is that something, how we interact and behave in the workplace and adding in that just description definition of civility could be something. So I think
Absolutely.
you certainly tapped into something that some folks could potentially see
Yeah.
or might want to change. All right. So, with the time that we have left, we're going to wrap up. And I just want to say if you've been part of this 4-part series, this is part three. Part one and two, we talked about various things about, navigating different kinds of tensions and behavior in the workplace, managing disagreements and diffusing tensions. And we talked about navigating political discussions with respect today, understanding the power of civility. We talked about organizational culture and mindful communication, the rise of incivility. We talked about it. And how do we really show up after the election for people, even before what that looks like? And so, Dr. Butts, if you would love to connect with people, again, we don't know when they're listening to this. It could be way after the election, but how can they connect with you if they want to learn more?
The best way to connect with me is via my website, which is simply NicoleButts.com. So NicoleButts.com. That's the best way to connect with me.
Okay. Any final thoughts for our audience? Anything you want to leave them with before we wrap?
Yeah, I think the final thing I would say around civility is when you are practicing civility, it has a very powerful impact on your relationships, both your personal relationships, your work relationships, and society as a whole. But you have to be intentional, you have to be mindful about doing exactly that. Incivility creates anxiety, it creates polarization. It also affects our mental and emotional health. So protect your own mental and emotional health, practice civility, and know when to walk away.
Well, I want to thank you for your time, for your insights today. I don't know if you could tell, but I was low key trying to like type some little
Right.
notes. It's always hard panel, being a moderator because like, oh, I want to write things down too. But thank goodness these are recorded and I can always go back. So thank you again for your time. I appreciate you. For everyone else, we'll see you next week in part four. Or again, if you're watching this as an on demand, take a look at part four. We're going to bring all of our panelists back and have an open forum and talk about really this election and what we need to be thinking about in elections in the future. So thank you so much, and
Thank
we'll
you.
see you next time.
Bye.